Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Judith Scheele. Judith is a professor of social anthropology, and she has spent almost 2 decades living in and around and researching Saharan societies. She is the author of 3 previous books and is the author of the recent book, Shifting Sands, A Human History of the Sahara, which is what we talk about in the conversation. We talk about the perceptions of the Sahara, the landscape, sand, fresh water in the Sahara, the use of camels, the many peoples of the Sahara, slavery and race in the Sahara, Islam, contemporary Sahara, and many other topics. One of the things I love about the podcast really is being able to talk to people from all over the world, but also to talk about different regions of the world. I have not done a lot of reading on the Sahara Desert in the 10 or 11 countries that are part of the Sahara in Africa. And I don't hear a lot of conversations about the Sahara. So it was wonderful to read her great book on the Sahara. She was absolutely a joy to talk to. She's lovely. She's brilliant. And to really learn a lot, at least on my end, about the Sahara, a big part of the world. It covers mass amounts of land and so many people groups and so much history there. And so it was all just new information for me, and I absolutely loved it. So I suspect many of the listeners will as well. As always, you can find this conversation and all the conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So get over there, subscribe, tell your friends. Appreciate that very much. And now I bring you Judith Scheele. I'm here with Judith Scheele. Judith, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk with you about your work. So big thanks.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you've written a really wonderful book. This is called Shifting Sands: A Human History of the Sahara. This is out through the wonderful Basic Books. So we'll talk all about it. Before we do, could you just tell listeners kind of a brief snapshot of kind of who you are professionally, academically, and how you came to write about the Sahara?
Okay, well, I'm a professor of social anthropology based in France at the EHESS. And I was trained at Oxford. And I came to the Sahara kind of accidentally. The first time I used to live in West Africa, and at some point I decided to go back to Europe and go back to grad school. I had no money left, so I hitchhiked my way back from Ivory Coast, and I got stuck in the Sahara. That was on the 11th of September, 2001. So it was absolutely, we kind of heard the news, but we heard it in the middle of the Sahara, so it just made no sense whatsoever. And then went to grad school in Oxford and told my supervisor I wanted to work on, so the people to hitchhike across the Sahara is quite difficult, and the people who will take you are, from a legal point of view, smugglers. So I had met quite a lot of them, and I'd liked them quite a lot. So I told my supervisor I would go back and write a book. And he just looked at me and laughed. So he first made me do something else. So I did my doctoral thesis on northern Algeria, on the Berber-speaking region right next to Algiers. And then I was a grown-up from an academic point of view, and I was allowed to do what I wanted to do. And hence I returned to the border area. So that was 10 years later.
Wow.
And then from there, I really loved it. And I decided in order to write a book on the Sahara, I would need to know more. And hence carried on a second bit of field work in Chad, in northern Chad. And every time it took about 1 year, 2 years of just living there and learning languages, getting to know people.
I guess in total, how long have you lived in and around or sojourned in and around the Sahara, I guess, at this point?
I think if you stick all the times back to back together, it's about 4 years.
Okay, that's quite a bit of time.
Over 20 years of my life, I suppose.
Wow. Just curiosity, I guess. So what is it, I guess, about the Sahara you personally you like? You keep coming back there, over 2 decades. What is it that keeps kind of pulling you pulling you back there, I guess, to be there with the people and do the research. But what do you like about it?
Well, I mean, some of it is in the logic of research. Once you start trying to understand a place, you realize you don't know anything. And then you want to understand more. And then the Sahara, being the way it is, people move around a lot and they have family everywhere. So you want to see those places. And they always say, of course, you can go and visit my cousins in Mauritania and you should go. And then you kind of want to do it. And that takes time because you don't just want to visit as a tourist. You want to spend time, talk to people. So there's always more. You always feel the answers on the other side of the horizon. So you always want to go further. And the other side is, of course, it's a very beautiful place to be. So the book is basically constructed against a narrative of exoticism, but this doesn't mean that the place isn't very appealing because it's so different. There's a lot of space and it feels there's a lot of possibility. And in the space, there are not that many people, so you do get to know them and they kind of know who you are and they have time to talk to you. So there's something very appealing about it. And then you have the very simple answer of amazing starry skies and you sit around a campfire and just talk to really interesting people. So
That's really nice. Yeah, that's really, really nice. Well, I got glimpses of that reading the book. I said, it'd be really, really nice to visit that part of the world as well. It's a place that doesn't, I would imagine, get a lot of. It's not a big tourism hotspot. It doesn't seem like, but yeah, the way you're doing good PR at the very good research, but there is this kind of like, this is something that people should look at more and see it for more than what it is. So so from, I think most people, you mentioned this in the beginning, a lot of people have this idea of the Sahara as this kind of barren, dry, sand place, that's very large on a big continent, and it has a bunch of other problems too: genocide, civil wars, conflict. I guess it's not to say that those things don't happen, but why do people usually have just such a one-dimensional image of the Sahara?
I mean, part of it is a desert, so it is quite dry. So there's no denying that, of course, which is what makes it a particular place. I think part of the answer is that it is, for a start, people know very little about the African continent generally, and the Sahara is kind of the least known part of the African continent. So it kind of participates in that kind of problem. And I think that's a problem I see even with my students. People are less and less interested in other places. So I think it's important to go against that because these places are there and we need to understand them. Partly it's because it's a desert, and deserts matter very much in all the great literate traditions of the Mediterranean. Deserts are there, and deserts play a really important role. So we can see it in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism. People constantly go off into the desert, and that's what prophets do. And that's where you go and find yourself. And I think this image it's very old. And because most of the literary traditions we have are written by people not from the Sahara, not because Saharans couldn't write, but because that's the way history is written in the Mediterranean, we have this outsider view, which quite often served a certain purpose. So people made arguments about civilization by talking about the desert, by talking about its opposite. We still do that, as if in order to define ourselves, we always have to define what we are not. And the desert was kind of a very suitable, because it looks so empty. It's a way you can project all of your own fears and fantasies. And people have done that for many centuries. And hence we have this kind of hodgepodge of civilizational images that are very complex and very appealing, because they're not totally wrong, but they're very largely wrong. And it's hard to go against that. And you just said I'm doing good PR work, but in a sense, if you want to write books, if you want to sell books about the desert, people don't really want to be told things they don't know. Generally, they want to be told things they actually know and recognize themselves. So it's really difficult to go against stereotypes. And also, lastly, the Sahara is kind of an in-between place. So if you're an academic or a writer, you work on North Africa, you speak Arabic, and you tend to stay on the coast. If you work on African studies, usually that means sub-Saharan Africa. So kind of by definition, there's a big gap that nobody's really interested in.
So give us the landscape of sorts of what do we mean when we say the Sahara? I mean, obviously it goes across a large part of the African continent, millions of miles. Which if I recall, it's 10 or 11 countries. Is this right? You don't have to list all of them, but what are we talking about in terms of the landscape or overview of when we say the Sahara, so people have an idea of, where is this, where are the countries, sort of the people groups, terrain, things like that. What's the kind of just general overview of what the Sahara is?
So it's large. It's about a third of the African continent, which itself is very large.
Yeah, it's large.
There's a lot of space. It tends to be, so there are 11 countries, some of which are part of North Africa and some of which are part of what we call Sub-Saharan Africa, or the Sahel. So this is Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, which is interesting for contemporary developments because the North African countries tend to be relatively rich. If you think of Libya was one of the richest country in Africa. I think it's number 2 or 3 now. There were times when people had an average income higher than in Europe. So this is really something. And right next to it, we have countries such as Chad and Niger. Every year there's a competition who of them is going to be last in the Human Development Index. So we have quite a lot of political and social and economic variety. In terms of the landscape, we have this image generally of the Sahara as kind of a big sandbox, which is not true. There's 20% of the kind of very picturesque sand dunes. On top of that, you have a large coastal area in Mauritania where you have a lot of fog. It's actually quite chilly most of the time. You have very high mountains, up to 11,000 feet, so you can get snow. In Morocco, you have ski resorts in the Sahara. You have kind of slightly monotonous, kind of brown, flat landscapes. You have the bottom of salt lakes, oases. So it's a very varied landscape. And especially the mountains are incredibly important for people who live there. But
Is some of the difference, I guess, with Libya and with Algeria, which are large countries, is that because there's something to do, maybe not entirely, but they're the ones that kind of at the north part get the southern Mediterranean coast? I mean, they're getting, especially Libya, I guess, is kind of the thing that makes me think of this. Whereas Chad, if I'm not mistaken, is kind of landlocked, so it's kind of right in the middle. And Libya is not a small country; it's a big country. Is there some of that because it's not just the Mediterranean, but the fact that it has access to this big body of water that on the other side is Greece and Turkey and all that? Is there something that contributes in terms of trade and things of that nature, or is that too on the nose?
Not really. It's mostly oil. It's very simple. Libya is one of the largest producers in the world of oil, and Algeria has a lot of gas. In both countries, once they discovered oil in the 1950s and 1960s, that's just what the economy is about. And hence, especially Libya under Gaddafi has been able to translate this oil wealth into infrastructure for kind of propaganda purposes. And that's just very visible. Their roads and their hospitals. Whereas, I have souvenirs of people in northern Chad who remember when Libya was very poor. So Libyans would come into Chad, which they consider to be a rich country, because there's more water, because there are mountains. And they used to poke fun at those poor Libyans who never ate any meat and would suck bones and skins. And nowadays, there's just totally the opposite. So it's just oil. I'd love to make a more complex argument, but...
No, the straightforward one works. That's very funny. So I guess... one of the things you're doing in the book is which is great, is you're trying to find the nuance. You're trying to find, how can we have a more robust picture of the Sahara? I guess, you were sort of telling that earlier, but I mean, what is that kind of nuance, right? Because you're having different people groups, different countries, different histories in some ways, and yet the Sahara kind of connects them of sorts. I mean, what do you see as your book is doing as far as kind of giving more of a nuanced, broader picture of the Sahara?
Well, historically, there have been different ways of looking at the Sahara. So for long, if you look at the map or a satellite image, which people in the past couldn't do, of course, you'd see this big brown blob. And it looks like a barrier. So the idea generally is there's North Africa, which isn't really Africa. It kind of belongs to the Mediterranean. People, they look like North Africa, they look like Arabs, they speak Arabic. So this is seen as being part of a different world, the Middle East, the Middle East and North Africa. So there was an anthropologist once who said, what East is Morocco in the middle of? So it kind of shows you just how weird sometimes these geographic boundaries are. And then you have Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the old image, the Sahara is a barrier. And then people say, well, actually, no, you have trade. So the Sahara acted as a bridge. But in both cases, you kind of don't see the Sahara because a bridge just crosses something you don't really want to see. And that means we have very little information. And this is not just us. If you look at from the 12th century onwards, the Arab accounts that we have, which are the most kind of the oldest written sources, they don't really talk about the people in the Sahara. They talk about Arab traders going to the Sahara. So this image is very, very old. And that has covered the fact that you have within the Sahara today, you have about 5 million people, probably more. It's very difficult to have reliable statistics. And because of the oil, they're immigrants, of course. So the Sahara today is an urban area. A lot of these immigrants are from various sub-Saharan African countries. So by now, loads of languages are spoken. Of course, it's very much a Muslim area. You also get a lot of Christians, and they're sometimes quite visible in the landscape. And I think historically, this is generally seen as an exception, but I think historically that was probably quite the same. The Sahara has always been an area that has attracted people because there are some natural resources. It used to be salt. Today it's oil and uranium. It's also an area where you have to be mobile if you want to make a living. You can't just sit there and kind of grow dates. You need input. You need to exchange your dates against other things. It's an area that has very few people, so people have always had to import people in various ways. So it is, in a sense, you can think of it as like a massive pump. It kind of attracts people into it, and sometimes it spits them out again according to political crisis, climate change, etc. And that means people have always been very mixed, and hence we have this image of usually kind of taciturn, veiled Tuareg or Arab-speaking Arabic or Berber, but there were loads and loads of much darker-skinned people, lots of women, of course, oases, agriculture, kind of sedentary agriculturists speaking languages like Songhai, Soninke, Tubu. And these things are not so visible, but they're certainly there. And I think this kind of historic diversity has translated into contemporary diversity, which is maybe bigger, but the principle is the same. So Saharan societies are societies that are very good at absorbing other people into what they're doing, sometimes through exploitation, sometimes through other things, and kind of creating a very particular synthesis, but that's always moving. So again, another example, you certainly have in mind this image of the kind of tourist brochure Tuareg who has a veil and drinks tea and rides his camel. And if you look at every single of the items that are part of the traditional Tuareg outfit, they're probably imported from somewhere else. And by the 19th century, the Tuareg sword was made in Manchester. And the cotton veils were also produced first in Egypt and then in England. So there's societies that have always accepted things from the outside and done different things with them. And I think that's still the case today.
That's a very interesting picture there of, there's a lot of mixtures, a lot of, things that are getting, synthesized, which is really, it's a picture we don't really hear a lot about, which is interesting. So tell us about the terrain, the landscape. So dry, sand, of course, that's the kind of, the standard. But there are other pieces as well. You talk about salt pans, mountains, as you were mentioning. People have talked about, dust that will carry across the globe. What some people don't know is the Sahara was really green at one point. You don't have to give us the full, geological history here. Did you? You must have read the book by is it Williams, right? When the Sahara was green, it came out a couple of years ago. Martin Williams, which kind of talks about the kind of ancient geological history of what that looks like. But yeah, so there's that whole piece, and then there's these. This kind of blew my mind that the Sahara holds 5% of the world's fresh groundwater, which is 30% of the world's freshwater reserves, which is pretty spectacular. We're talking about the globe, so the entire the planet. So yeah, what's the irrigation look like for them? So yeah, what's kind of give us a picture of the landscape, both in, you can talk about the sandstorms and dust and mountains, but then also, this other history that where it also has a lot of, fresh water as well, reserves. What's the story here?
Oh, where to start? So, let's start with the water. So yes, the Sahara is very dry, but has a lot of sweet, clean groundwater. One of the reasons is most of this water is below the ground. Just to give you an idea of size, I did the math. It's about 7 times the quantity of water that you find in the Great American Lakes, which in turn are 20% of surface fresh water. So most of the fresh water in the world is underground.
Wow.
So it's basically huge.
Wow.
I don't know if you've seen the lakes, you can just imagine. But of course, nobody sees it, so it's very difficult to actually realize.
Is that because of its previous history of being very, it was a different terrain, millions of years ago? Is that the reason why?
So the kind of scientific consensus now is that the Sahara has always moved between what they call green phases and brown phases, which isn't necessarily the best way of thinking about it, but that's what they say. And that's not due to human use, it's due to just small variations in the Earth's axis. So if it tilts a little bit, and that's how we got ice ages. And basically, during ice ages, the Sahara was very dry because a lot of the water was not available, it was frozen. And then you have humid periods when it kind of tilts back. And people talk about the Green Sahara, we shouldn't exaggerate. So there were times like during the French colonial times that people had notions of the whole forest covering the Sahara. They also blamed the absence of forest not on climate change, but on people's use. So they're basically the idea of being that camel nomads and goats had come and eaten all the trees, and hence we need to plant trees again. That's not how it works. So the Green Sahara probably didn't have any forest, but had savanna, had lakes, looked a little bit like the Sahel. What we know is that there were quite a lot of animals, because we can find traces of fish. So a lot of the kind of flat bits, the salt pans, were actually lakes. There was a time when Lake Chad, which is still, I think, the largest body of water in Africa, was about 20 times bigger. So it covered most of the contemporary country of Chad, went up all the way to the Tibesti Mountains. So that's a large chunk of the Sahara.
Wow.
This is also incidentally where the first, what we now know as the earliest human remains have been found, right next to what would have been Lake Chad. So these were important places for evolution. They were very varied places, kind of mosaics of swamps, and basically allowing people to have very different forms of economies and ecological survival. So the last Green Sahara peaked about 10,000 years ago, and ever since things have gone drier and drier. And we can explain the kind of economies of the Sahara that we can observe historically, and that we can still see today through kind of adaptations by people who probably lived in the Sahara when it was still green, and then they had to somehow keep going while the water disappeared. So this is really an example of climate change as it happened, and people being very ingenious in trying to find adaptations to it. Now, there's still worries about desertification, which are different nowadays. We can show that things have sped up. They're also proceeding a different way. So as I said, green and brown are not very good. They're kind of proxies to try to understand what's going on. But vegetation is not necessarily a good thing. And I think one of the things I wanted to say in the book is that we need deserts. The world needs deserts. And this kind of drive that we have, which is a very kind of 18th century drive to say, well, the desert is a problem, so we have to do something about it, needs thinking. Because you just mentioned dust. The Sahara, one of the things the Sahara really produces is dust. About half of all the dust in the Earth's atmosphere. And although it's unpleasant when you get it in the eyes, it's actually absolutely necessary to keep the world going as it is. It cools down the Atlantic, it feeds marine animals, so they need iron, and a lot of that iron comes from the Sahara Desert. It also kind of nourishes the Amazon forest, which needs phosphates, and a lot of those phosphates come from the Sahara. So if there was no dust, if the Sahara were to disappear tomorrow, we would actually face kind of ecological catastrophe.
I think a lot of people, I didn't know that until a couple of years ago myself. A lot of people don't realize how much the dust from the Sahara does impact the rest of the world, including the Amazon, and how much of it is needed with nutrients and things of that nature. It is pretty spectacular to think about dust from an African continent going over an ocean and and helping another continent. Of course, all of these were connected millions of years ago, but it is just wild to think that is still occurring, that it can carry that far and that long.
And the reason why it's the nutrient rich is, of course, because these are bottoms of lakes. So this dead fish, basically. It's dead fish bones being thrown back into the Atlantic to feed new fish. So it's quite fun.
Yeah, it's a wild story. So obviously, the people will know about camels. That camels are there in the Sahara. You give them some time in the sun, so to speak, in your book. Tell us about the many uses of camels. You talk about it used economically for sure, but obviously with the nomadic pastoralism and even for milk. So they're used for many different things. I mean, I'm sure you've ridden on camels. I'm sure that you've seen these up close. What are all these different uses of camels in the Sahara?
So for a start, there are loads of camels. I talk a lot about camels. I'm very fond of camels. I haven't actually ridden them myself. Women don't ride camels very often.
Okay,
A lot of
okay.
time riding donkeys, but
Interesting. So you've never ridden a camel?
a little bit, but not very
Not
often.
for a long time. Oh, interesting.
So camels, for once, there are loads of other livestock, and they're important. So I think, again, what I was trying to bring across is that, for a start, nomadic pastoralism, which we tend to think of as a kind of relic of the past, still is alive and kicking.
Yeah.
So if you look
Different
at
parts of the world.
statistics,
Yeah.
if you look at statistics of camel herds in the last 20 years, they've actually exploded in countries like Chad. So there are loads and loads of camels.
Wow.
It doesn't mean that the camels are owned by the people that used to own them. So you can kind of trace patterns and property. I know the late president of Chad owned thousands and thousands of camels, which makes sense in a context where you could put your money in a bank, but you don't really know if the bank is still going to be functioning in 10 years' time. So it makes much more sense to have livestock. Livestock is the original capital, and in Arabic you have a very clear connection, but also in English, cattle and capital are the same word.
Sure.
In Arabic is mal and mal, and it's the only capital that really grows like naturally. So you have a female camel, you will have 3 or 4 sometime. So that makes sense. So they're part of very kind of modern economic strategies, also because you have demographic growth in places like Nigeria. So exporting fresh meat from the southern Sahara is a big business. It's one of the biggest business that you can get in southern Saharan countries, which, as I said, are pretty poor. You also have a kind of cultural investment in camels in the richer countries, where very few people still work as nomadic pastoralists because it's a really tough life. So nowadays, if you are of Saharan origin and you have a lot of money, maybe gained through oil, you'd much rather pay somebody else to look after your camels, either a poor cousin or labor migrants. And there are quite a lot of labor migrants who leave traditional kind of pastoral economies to work either in Libya or Algeria or even in the Gulf states. There's a kind of huge informal economy of camel herds. So you have that going on. And then you also have people who still identify as Saharans, which happens a lot in Mauritania, which is kind of the only Saharan country where you really only get desert. So this is the dominant culture. And again, once you're a little bit rich, maybe a civil servant, you don't want to live in a tent, or you can't live in a tent, but you certainly want to keep camels, pay somebody else to look after them, and then maybe for the holidays you would go and sit in a tent, ideally an air-conditioned tent, and drink camel milk and kind of live the life as you yourself imagine your ancestors would have lived. And this is actually really important. This is kind of the main form of tourism. It involves drinking camel milk, which some people insist is absolutely necessary for their survival. It's got great health benefits. I think that's actually true. But again, it's a bit more of that. It's also a way of being a particular person and maintaining a particular identity, which a lot of people cherish in changing circumstances. So camels are still there, and camels are used in different ways. The last point is that we say camels. We should really be saying dromedaries because they're one-humped camels. But in local languages, there are 20 or 25 words for camels. So there's a huge difference between a 3-year-old female camel, between a 20-year-old male camel, between a riding camel, a camel trained to carry loads, a camel used to mountains, a camel used to sand, etc. So there's a huge variety that we don't even begin to understand. So again, it's very complex.
Have you tried milk from camels?
Oh yes, I certainly.
How does it taste?
It tends to fatten me up by drinking fresh milk. It's nice.
Yeah. Okay.
A little bit salty. It's one of the other uses of camels. A lot of the water in the Sahara is very salty. So you can either drink it and feel it quite sick, or you can get camels to drink it and they turn it into sweet milk. So it's one of the magic powers of camels.
I know in Mongolia still they still drink. I don't know how widespread it is, but they still drink horse milk, which is also supposed to be like a superfood. It's supposed to be like super nourishing for you, super good for you. So it's but I hear that has a distinct taste though. So it's for people that aren't used to it. It's I'm sure milk here from cattle is a distinct taste. So it's just different whatever you're familiar with. But I've always found that really interesting to see. We do it one way in one part of the world, but it's very common to do it a different way in another part of the world, which is really interesting. So tell us about the people. The people in the Sahara. Again, we're talking currently, 10 nation states. Of course, there's been lines drawn on a map or sort of relevant in some ways, and I guess probably not relevant. But yeah, you talk about many of the different people across the Sahara. You mentioned at different points how the Sahara, I think you mentioned it earlier here too, is this story of migration. You talk about the importance of genealogies. And then, you mentioned the Berbers, which some people may not be familiar with this people group. Maybe chat about them as well and how impactful they are for the Sahara. But yeah, generally, tell us about the different folks you've encountered and people across the Sahara.
So yes, there are 11 nation states and borders. And it's a debate whether some of the borders do matter. I mean, as I said, a lot of the people I work with are smugglers, and if you don't have a border, you can't have smugglers. So they're very important. But historically, of course, there were even the idea of the nation state would not have made any sense in much of the world, and certainly not in the Sahara. So what you get are different linguistic groups, and I say linguistic because, as I said, life in the Sahara is about weaving connections. And the most efficient way, we all know too, of weaving connections, if in the absence of kind of state or policies of that kind, is by getting married. So there's been a lot of intermarriage. And the way people tend to define even today, beyond kind of national passports, of which many of them have quite a selection, is through family. And that's not just because they're very nice people or they love their family, which is also the case, but because family allows you to have far-reaching connections. And as people are mobile, very often they have family in many different countries. And that's a way in which you can survive. If something goes wrong in your country, you can go and live with them, for instance. People in the southern Sahara all have vivid memories of drought, so they know it's important to be able to go somewhere else. And this is something you can show historically. So if you're a Saharan and you want to get on, ideally you try to have a very large family. So you get married strategically, and you might marry off your children or your sisters and brothers in a way that you can basically construct yourself enough flexibility to survive any kind of crisis. So these are not subsistence economies, because the crisis will happen all of the time. So if you just work enough and produce enough to survive, you're just going to die. The next crisis comes around. So people really, they're constantly trying to minimize risks and spread their movements around. And that means that it's actually quite difficult to determine who belongs where, both in terms of race, which is what the French tried when they came, and even in terms of linguistic belonging. So I talk quite a lot about genealogies. And the thing about genealogies is that they are always fictional, in as much as if you trace your genealogy just through your male line, so you only remember your father and your father's father and so on, a lot of your family members drop out. And they often tend to be the ones that might have come from a different linguistic groups. What happened in the Sahara is that you had both ways. So you had some people who said it's all about mothers. So they would think of their grandmother and the grandmother's grandmother, etc., and belong to that group. And others did it through their fathers. And the good thing is that you can do both, and hence belong to the different groups. So there's a lot of moving in between categories. And linguistic groups is a good way of talking about it, because we can learn several languages. So you can, sometimes in some contexts you can be an Arab, in other contexts you can be Tuareg. You might be a Songhai when you talk to some of your cousins, or when it suits you because you want to negotiate a better price. So people have been very flexible, I think, and family has allowed them to do that. Beyond that, you have languages that are recognized, and people will talk in terms of different groups just to make sense of their world. So you have the great nomadic groups, or historically nomadic, the Arabs, Berber speakers, and the Tubu in Chad and Sudan. And then just below you have Sahelian groups, Soninke, Songhai, the Kanembu, who are mostly, they tend to be more agriculturalists, have very close connections to the Sahara. And this is the belt where you've had very old African states. And I think this is not just coincidental, just to show how much the economies in the Sahara, so these are kind of on the border of the Sahara, and they're states that exist because they've always acted as intermediaries in trade with other populations. So I think that means that when you make a choice, whether you want to be Tuareg today or Arab, it's also very often a political choice. So if you start speaking another language, it might be a way of talking to the Sultan or wanting to live in a kind of more state-run polity for a while. So basically what I want to stress is this flexibility, and how categories are set up for people to move around, and genealogies allow them to do that. Also genealogies, because sometimes they're written down, but they're very malleable. I think we all know that. In certain contexts, you might want to forget the aunt that's always embarrassing, or the cousin or the brother, and it's quite easy to drop them, especially if you have a lot of family. And it's also quite easy to make claims on some famous uncle who actually might not remember you. So it's very flexible ways of defining who people are. And very often it makes probably more sense to talk in terms of languages than kind of descent. There have been genetic studies of Saharan populations, and I will get to the Berbers in a bit. Generally, when you have any kind of historical genetics, they always show us that we're much more mixed than we ever thought we were. All these famous stories of all Brazilians have some African ancestors, whether they like it or not. But in the Sahara, even more so. So it's almost impossible to find any bounded groups. There's a kind of genetic pool. In every village, you will find a huge variety of ancestors. It doesn't necessarily show, but we can certainly show historically that really these are societies born out of movement. The Berbers are an interesting category because it's an exonym. So it's not a word that people would have used of themselves historically. It's kind of the equivalent of barbarian. It's the Arabic version of the Greek barbar, which gave us our barbarian, people who speak a funny language. We know historically so it basically started to be used of North Africans by the Arabs during the Arab conquest. So in the 8th century. They didn't understand what people were saying. They just referred to all of them as Berbers. The thing is that as every conquering army, they needed soldiers, so they enrolled a lot of Berbers in their ranks. At that time, to be kind of paid as a soldier, you needed to be Arab. So a lot of these Berbers then became Arab, quite simply there were times you could go to the market and buy yourself an Arab genealogy and redefine. And it makes sense. Doesn't mean that they forgot about being Berbers. Again, you have this flexibility. People themselves clearly didn't think of themselves as Berbers. The word then kind of caught up. People started talking about it. Berber is a language group now, so the Tuareg are seen as Berbers because they speak a dialect of Berber. It was used quite a lot in the 1980s. You have kind of cultural movements, Berber cultural movements. Nowadays, a lot of Berbers prefer to talk of themselves as Imaziren, which means free people. Also complicated because there's some really Mazirens that have always been called themselves Imarizen in Morocco. The Tamashek themselves, sometimes they think of themselves as one people, sometimes they don't. They're different federations. So it's all, once you start looking into these labels, they become very, very complex.
It's interesting when you look around the world and you see in all parts of the world, I mean, by ethnic group alone, and then you get language, and then you get all these different histories. There is within and between so much diversity in so many places. And obviously, you can think of, Eastern Europe. You can think of the Caucasus Mountains region. You can think of, obviously here in Northern Africa. I mean, there's just so much mixture all around the world. It's just such a fascinating story to think about that.
Well, what we can say usually is that people start defining themselves in ethnic terms when there's an interest.
That's a good point.
So there's, for instance, a state, and you want to belong to that state. Or what happened in Eastern Europe, you had to have a nationality, or you would just be nobody at all, and you might get killed. And then you start fixing these categories, and that can be extremely violent, as we know. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it is interesting. The nation state idea, while it's not, it's not a necessarily a novel concept. I mean, I do see the nation state post World War I, post empire, if you will. Of course, it existed before that, but it really took prominence, kind of in the 20th century. And the way we know it now today in some ways. And so it is strange to have folks identified by a nation state when, I mean, their history, their lineage, their culture goes back thousands of years in some cases. So it is a very interesting thing to do. Tricky topic you mentioned in the book. I'm curious for this. You don't have to get in the weeds of it, but you talk about this connection between slavery and race in the Sahara. Now, most people in the U.S. will think about slavery here in the United States, which was, again, a pretty dark chapter in the United States history. And obviously, for listeners around the world in different countries, usually have some, dark chapters of their own with slavery. But I guess more just focused here on the Sahara. You put the two together, which, I mean, again, I was just kind of going through it, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. How do you see slavery and race being kind of connected here in the Sahara? What makes it, distinct from other places? If so, what's the kind of picture here?
It's very complicated.
Of course, I'm sure.
Partly it's complicated because we now have a lot of debate about race and slavery and the relation between both. And I think the general consensus on modern European thinking on race is that it was very closely connected to slavery. So that the fact that Africans were enslaved then led to theories of why they were inferior to justify it, and they were put in a position in which you could find proof. The Sahara is interesting because you also have a very long history of slavery, and also mostly directed against people of sub-Saharan African origin. You also have racism historically. You have it today. It is changing all of the time. I mean, race is a social construct, and hence it changes historically all of the time. So you have elements that look quite familiar, but it's not quite the same. So it's an interesting case study because it helps you. If you put the two together, it kind of helps you to see the odd bits, and that very often is useful in helping you ask the right questions and kind of denaturalizing certain things that happened in one setting. And I think the big difference about slavery, or one of the big differences about slavery in the Sahara, is that most slaves, there are no plantations, so most slaves were put into families or in kind of family-like context. That's not to say that this is better. Families can be terrible places, and they're terribly hierarchical, which meant that people preferred female slaves. So there was a moment when the transatlantic slave trade was really at its height, that the male slaves, which had no value to the north, were sent south, and then the female ones were sent north. So those two systems work quite well together. And the reason why female slaves were preferred was very largely because they can produce children. And in the Sahara at that time, political systems, if you wanted to be powerful, what you needed was not a lot of money, but you needed a lot of people to be with you. And the best way of having a lot of people, as I said, is having a very large family. And that's by having lots of children. And the more women you can have, the more children you can have. And that meant, for reasons partly of Islamic law, in which if a free father has a child with his slave, his female slave, that child is recognized as a free person and is theoretically on a par with all the other children that father might have. So that's Islamic law. People don't always follow the law, but in the Sahara they did mostly, and I think it's because they wanted to have children. The one thing that made them powerful and wealthy was having loads of children, and hence there was good reason to kind of be colorblind in that aspect. And that means because elites were more likely to have slaves, they were actually more likely to have darker skin. So you have a kind of sensitivity to phenotype, but it worked out in very different ways. So there's several sultans of Morocco who were rather dark-skinned, because over generations you can see it repeating themselves. This doesn't mean that people did not talk rudely about blackness, and it wasn't seen as something necessarily very beautiful, but blackness was defined very differently. So when you go to the Sahara even today, if you don't know the setting, you might refer to somebody as dark-skinned, and actually they know they're purely white, because blackness is defined as related to your status, and that's defined as related to your father's status. So if you don't know the people, you get very good very quickly at reading different signs, because bodily appearance is not just about genetics, it's about how you carry yourself, how you dress yourself, how you treat others, basically, if you assume you're a top dog, then you will be, and people will recognize that. But these things you learn, they're socially learned, and at first you don't have them. So you have kind of the same elements, but they're articulated differently, and that's not to say that it's any better, or that slavery, that this is whole theory that Islamic slavery was somehow nice. It wasn't. It's just things can be different, and we need to pull these things apart and see them more clearly. The additional kind of difficulties that today, of course, that you have movements for recognition of black North Africans. So all four North African countries have substantial black populations, and they tend to be recognized by others as descendants of slaves. So sometimes, till recently, that was still inscribed in their family names. So in Tunisia, on your passport, it would say you are the abid of somebody, rather than having the ancient slaves, the former slaves of others. So these people now stand up and say no, since 2011, when there have been democratic changes. In the North African countries, they find it very often difficult to make themselves heard, and the way they can make themselves heard is by kind of feeding into a global rhetoric on race, which very often is American as well. People in Tunisia think Americans. So you have this kind of confusion of different categories, and they don't always work out. So northern activists might not be able to talk to people in the south because they're very different ways of thinking about it. And I think one last point that's really important on this is that we tend to think of freedom as kind of the opposite of slavery, and freedom is kind of an individual cutting loose of all ties, being able to do whatever you like to do, being a proper individual. Whereas historically, and even today in the Sahara, that just doesn't quite work. If you're just on your own, you're just not going to make it. So people, on the contrary, they want to have ties. And what really matters is the quality of those ties. So people want to be, we have stories in the southern Sahara especially, where there's no slavery. I mean, none of these, slavery has been abolished officially throughout the region, but people seek out forms of dependence because otherwise they would quite simply starve. Because it's only by having a powerful patron that you can get access to water, to food, to schooling, to anything you need. So it's we also need to rethink our notion of freedom in order to understand what is going on.
It is quite complicated. It is and different. But it is interesting how for humans we enslave other humans. It's over through history. It's a very interesting thing that we do as humans.
It's an almost universal history.
Yeah.
There are very few societies, but they're not. I mean, there's some French anthropologists said there's societies who make slaves and others who kill their captives. So you can choose.
Yeah. Yeah, so more to learn about this is very, very, very interesting part of this tough topic, but how it looks around the world is very interesting. So, okay, so religion. Most people, you're talking about in the book, these standard narratives of Islamization of the Sahara, and most people focus on the radical parts of Islam as the prevalent theme discussed in media. Which, to be fair, there are. It's not to say there isn't, or there isn't stuff that hasn't been really radical from some of these places. But you mentioned that it was spread by conversion, not by conquest with Islam. So what? Tell us what is the more recent history of Islam in the Sahara region, and kind of how it looks today of sorts. I mean, obviously there's some tough interpretations and tough actions carry out, but that's probably not the majority. What's the the tenor of it, I guess, now of how Islam has worked, in more modern times and what that historical connection is?
I mean, historically, the Sahara, some of it was converted, or people converted very early on.
Early on in
history.
Okay. So right when Islam started, 8th century, 9th century, probably
Well, again, it's very difficult to, maybe the 10th century, rather.
Okay.
But it's very difficult to know because you have certain texts, usually written by the missionaries. They tend to say everybody has converted, of course. You have a few archaeological traces, but not that much. So you might be able to identify a mosque, but that doesn't tell me very much about what people really believe. So it's actually a very hard question. And I think the way we should start really is by thinking about the model we have of kind of a faith being brought and then everybody converts and that's it, and nobody ever goes back, which is what missionaries like you to think. But actually that's not really how it happens. People, it's not that they backslide, but they will take certain ideas, they might not like other ideas. And of course the missionary himself, once he spent 20 years probably getting married to, say, a Tuareg lady, he probably will have changed some of his opinions. Maybe he never came back. So I think it's better to think of it in terms of an exchange of ideas. I said earlier that what really stands out in the Sahara, I think, is this capacity to bring in things from the outside and make them yourself. I think, in a sense, Islam worked very much in the same way. So quite from the 14th, 15th century, we see really important Islamic centers of learning. The famous libraries of Timbuktu, everybody has heard of, but in Mauritania too, and in loads of places in southern Algeria. When I went myself, I kind of stumbled over these massive manuscript libraries, and suddenly I had to do something with them. I wasn't really prepared, but people say, "Oh, do you want to look at my books?" And there are 2,000 manuscripts sitting in the family home, and some of them are quite usual, but some of them are really quite valuable. So what do you make of it, and you have to understand why they're so important. Why people, I mean, thinking back, say the bulk of these manuscripts dates from the 17th, 18th century. At that time, every sheet of paper had to be imported on camelback. So why did people bother?
Yeah.
A lot of it is about
important.
It has to be important, but what for? Because a lot of it is about Islamic law. People wanted to follow the law and do it right. The standard narrative we have of the law is usually somebody comes and they make you follow the law, and if you don't, you go to prison. That's clearly not the case because there was nobody to tell them. So they're sitting in the middle of the Sahara. So I think it helps us to understand the kind of appeal of this universalizing way of understanding the world. Religion tells you what is what and where we're going and what you should do and what is good and what is not good. And I think these rules themselves had a huge appeal. And we need to try to understand why. But of course, people copied them down, they thought about them, they modified them. So they really turned Islam into something that was their own. And once you do that, you always, at some point, will have some reformer coming back from Mecca saying, whatever you're doing is wrong. And this happens in all agricultural societies, in all Islamic societies, in all Christian societies. Once you have a standard rule, of course, you're going to break the rule all of the time, and somebody will tell you. Usually people don't like being told. So we have these reformers who go back home and they don't last very long. But there are always some people who pick up. So basically, as soon as you have conversion to a religion, you will have conflicts. And you will have... And I think what's going on today is quite similar to that. So by now, all of the Sahara, apart from immigrants, is pretty much Muslim. And again, you have the old, long-standing elite families who have the manuscript libraries. Very often, they're also important landholders, because a lot of the kind of oasis settlements in the Sahara, they started out as kind of religious, almost convents of places of kind of worship, but also of work, a bit like the monasteries in medieval Europe. Hence, they could become extremely wealthy. People would give land to them and trees and camels. So today, when people criticize traditional Islam, very often they criticize those people who, for the last 3 centuries, held loads of land, usually had loads of slaves too. So these are really centers of slavery too, because they're centers of agricultural development. And as people resent them, and you can understand why. And some of these local reformers, and now, I mean, locally again is difficult because people in the region, they watch television, they listen to the radio, they have internet. So there's a lot of Islamic knowledge out there, and actually allows people who were always told, well, you don't know anyway, you can't read, or you don't read properly, you haven't studied for 5 years, allows them to have access to the truth. And some of the truth that are kind of propagated by Islamic scholars, they're very, very appealing about equality, about it's all about your relationship to God, you can be good, and that actually makes you better than the man up the road who's been exploiting your family for generations. It's very, very appealing. And if you add to this a general political situation in which people are getting poorer and poorer, and they feel they're losing control of their lives, there's instability, there's a lack of justice, that people go around stealing your livestock and your land, there's nothing you can do about it. You have a whole belt of state failure in the Sahel, then it becomes very appealing to have somebody who says, no, this is how you do it. This is justice, and you are as good as the next man, and you have the same access to pasture, you have the same access to natural resources than the other person. So you get this kind of hodgepodge of radical Islamic ideas that get turned into radical political ideas. But you can't really blame people for wanting to shake off kind of structures of domination that have been there. And those who kind of are most engaged in radical Islamic activities very often are descendants of former slaves. Because Islam tells them you're not a slave, you're a believer.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story though, because I mean I do like the idea of how you talk about conversion, but it's exchange of ideas, and I think once things get carried out further and further away, and you have all these other mixtures, it's going to look different. It's going to be a bit different. Of course, you're going to have people that want to follow it particular ways, but so I guess the last question I have here is. Today, in a modern context, much of the West sees the Sahara in this part of the world as needing security and development and all these things, which, I'm sure those things aren't untrue necessarily. But again, it feels very kind of a very myopic way of viewing the region. You say that contemporary Sahara is cosmopolitan, it's urban, it's multilingual, it has a lot of artistic creativity, economic innovation. So I guess the question here is how do we hear more of that story of the Sahara, and not just all of the doom and gloom and it's sand and dust and and violence and it needs development, and I mean, obviously that's not necessarily untrue, but I mean that's not all it is, and there is this bigger picture of it. How do we hear more about those parts that you're laying out in the contemporary piece?
Well, I suppose the answer I'm supposed to give is you should read my book.
Right, that's right.
There are references to Saharan music, there's Saharan music festivals, there's literature, there's film. That's one side of it. Ideally, you go and you would see. Although saying that, the situation at the moment is really dire. So the most parts of the Sahara, you can't go. And
I think most people hit up Morocco. I think, Egypt, I guess, is not sort of connected there. But yeah, Sudan is not probably the number one place to go at the moment.
What I'm thinking of are really the kind of slums of the large cities that have sprung up around infrastructural developments, or mostly in Algeria and Libya, which, as I said, were rich countries, but it's difficult to go now. I mean, Libya is really not unless you're really intrepid, it's really not a good holiday destination. So it's all within limits. Going back to the idea of security, yes. So basically, what I say in the book is that you have the general, it's a bit more macro, the engagement of, say, first world countries with the African continent as a whole has kind of shifted from, after colonialism, to a rhetoric of development. The idea, you just need to all be the same. You just need to launch these countries on the same path, and that didn't really work. No. Then we moved to humanitarian catastrophe, so the idea of Africans are starving, we need to help them, we need to keep them alive, which is kind of not very much in terms of politics, but it's kind of the started with the Ethiopian famine, and it's an image we all know. And now we've moved on to security. So the idea is that we need to, especially in Europe, for once we need to protect ourselves. And this is something that is being declined in very different ways. We talk about migration, about terrorism, about a lot of these things are actually not about Europe. So it's also a bit of a kind of an egocentric European view that everything is always about Europe. And that has led to a lot of money being diverted from development projects, which have their own problems. And I don't think you can develop the whole world. We know why not. But still, people like having hospitals, they like having roads, they like having schools. Generally, there's something in there. But now all this money goes into national armies and police. And again, people generally also like having some kind of security. They like knowing that if somebody steals their car, they can go and complain. But they haven't seen any of that. What they've seen is national armies being overfed, in a sense, becoming larger and larger and larger, and often ending up the only state institutions that still work, because all the rest of the state has been underfunded. Schools are not working, roads don't work, there's no health system. And we saw with COVID, none of these countries are actually touched because we had no idea what was going on. And people tend to die before they get old enough to actually that's why there's no cancer. People in Chad, I think the average life expectancy is something around 50. So this is really means something to people. They know it. They see people dying all of the time for really silly reasons, because there is no investment in the state. But there is investment in the army, which pushes people into becoming soldiers. And they know that the only way forward is by waving a gun, in a sense, and making themselves dangerous. So also buy into this rhetoric of, if you don't help us, then we will be dangerous to Europe. Which might not or might not be true, but often they have no other choice. So you have this militarization of the state of society, and that clearly is not a good thing, and people know that. And it has blown up into Europe's face. If you look at the Sahel, there have been military coups in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad also in its own way. And all of these coups were carried out by armies that had just received massive grants from the European Union. So I don't have a solution, but clearly what's going on right now is not right. I mean, it's not helping anyone. And the kind of death rate in places like, we've seen Sudan, but also central Mali is just, it's absolutely devastating. So this is not the right road. I don't know what else to do, but this is clearly not right.
Well, it's at a disservice, because, like, as you're saying, I think that there is so much rich history and there's so much, creativity, and there's so many things that folks there can do. And so, throwing money or throwing weapons at them is not the answer. No. But yes, I think your book does a fantastic job of highlighting all of the various nuance and stories and different components to it, not just the kind of one-dimensional thing we get over here in the West. So it's very good in that way. Judith, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking about a topic that doesn't get talked about enough. I really enjoyed it. Big learning experience for me. I really, really found it deeply fascinating. Want to know more. And thanks for all of your hard work and your wisdom and your time. I really enjoyed the conversation.